I mean, it's an interesting thing, you know. Living here for so long, it kind of started to blur, you know, where it just becomes this fuzzy backdrop. Where I think for me, the pattern and the sounds of the actual water, you know, becomes the thing that sort of draws me in more, you know. And yeah, especially with different daylight, moonlight, I find myself sort of looking sort of down at the water versus like out at the city skyline.
Right. The Mississippi River has been well, first a road and then a barrier, but to me, I guess it's always just been a calming presence. It's history. It's flowing right past you. You can sit on the banks and think about everything that has happened there and that will happen, and it's just a big continuity.
My mother had to recite poems as a child. She was a New Orleanian, and so was her mother and her grandmother. If the river belongs to the nation and the levee belongs to the state, and it goes on and on about all these different segments of who owns what. It's a fascinating idea. So people build houses on the Batcher, which in fact sort of doesn't exist because the water comes up and it's gone. But that's where we would go and play, and we would get see animals, birds, and plants. It's like a nature study for city girls.
I mean, we all relate philosophically to rivers. Like life is like a river. We're like each one of us is a piece of flotsam and jetsam in a river. And we don't have any control of it where it's going. It just turns and takes us. We don't know it. We have no, and then we're going to end up in some oblivion, one way or another. It's the movement. It's this big. It's quiet, but it's powerful, powerful, powerful. The boats you hear the seagulls when you go down there, and the birds and stuff. But now there's people, which is nice. But yes, there's a lovely movement to it, and I think that's what's really imaginative.
A lot of my friends who are not from here ask me, why do you stay? You know, everything's going to be gone, or everything is gone, or there's a hurricane every 5 minutes there, a flood every 5 minutes. Just 2 days ago, there was a massive weather event. Why do you stay? Okay, it's kind of exciting to be on the front line of climate change, to be honest with you, so that we can see what's happening, this environmental destruction. We're the canary in the coal mine. That's one reason for staying. I have a morbid sense of curiosity, and I'm a filmmaker, I'm an artist, so that's what's driving my morbid sense of curiosity. The second thing, it's my home. And although I've traveled a lot outside of my home for many, many years, for decades, now I'm back here to witness what's happening. So I guess that's kind of the main thing, is the witnessing of it.
I want to be connected to the planet. And to me, when I've experienced that, every morning running, we run on the grass, and we run in the green, and we run in the rain, and we run by the river. It's not going off and hiding from modern times. It's just experiencing the best. And I've gotten, so I never want to be in a car again. Quit driving. Got rid of the car. Because it just separates you. It just separates you from wonderful things like the river.
You know, there's a lot in it that we don't know about, a lot of bones and a lot of fish bones, people bones, boat bones, all sorts of bones. And when the river got really low, all these boat parts and boats, old boats that were exposed. I mean, huge things that were just there all along but we didn't know about it. So that fascinated me too, that the river has all these secrets that we don't know about. We don't know what the river is hiding and what secrets, what's it seen over the years. That used to always amaze me, you know, what does the river know that I don't know?
Well, we know that there was this tragic accident of the Monmouth, which crashed near Prophet Island, which is just a little bit north of Port Allen here on the Mississippi River. And it was a foggy night, and one boat crashed into another near the island, and there was a large loss of life of Native Americans. And this, I had never thought of the Trail of Tears as coming through our own backyard. This had been something, oh, that was out west, that was the Midwest, that was Oklahoma. But of course the rivers were roads, and so these people, these Native Americans that were put on boats in Florida and other places were brought up the Mississippi River to move further west to Oklahoma, and this happened on that journey.
Hi, I'm Bob Thomas, and I'm standing at the headwaters of the Great Mississippi River, and it's going to ultimately collect water from the watershed of 41% of the continental United States, ranging from here down to the Gulf of Mexico, and from on the east, basically the Pittsburgh area, all the way on the west over in Wyoming and Montana. And every drop of water that hits the ground there potentially could run into this system and make this massive Mississippi that we know so well in New Orleans. Right now you can see Lake Itasca, which feeds the water into the beginning of the Mississippi River. And you see the babbling brook. It sounds like a babbling brook. It's actually a little waterfall where water is pouring out of Lake Itasca and becoming the Mississippi River instantly. It's kind of interesting to somebody who's lived most of his life in New Orleans, because I drink the Mississippi River water every day. It comes through my faucet in my house, and it's kind of fun to do something I wouldn't do down there, where I can take a little sip of water out of this relatively fresh area and know that these same water molecules that are all around me are heading toward where I live, heading toward the Gulf of Mexico, which means that they get to the base of the food webs that support all the life in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay. And here's our finished product.
Is the Mississippi River drinkable?
You know, I certainly would think that I'm drinking worse. If I had to, I would drink it. But no, certainly it would be much healthier and much more suitable for intaking if you waited until on the backside of the treatment process, for sure. Where are we standing here in Donaldsonville on top of the Mississippi River levee? Right behind us is our existing pump station for the Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District. That was constructed in 1955 by the Department of Public Works. And what it's doing is just that. It's taking about 500 cubic feet per second of water, taking it from the Mississippi River and putting it into the head of Bayou Lafourche, which is just beyond us over here. In the foreground here, right behind me, obviously is a vacant piece of property, but hopefully within the next year or so, we'll begin constructing a new pump station which will give us at least 1,000 CFS capacity, at least doubling the current capacity that we have. The purpose of what we're doing here is conveying water from the Mississippi River into Bayou Lafourche that's ultimately used for two main purposes. One, it's the source water for 300,000 plus people that live in the four-parish area that we serve, along with industry as well. But also what we're doing, and one of the main driving forces behind us wanting to expand our pumping capacity, is we're pushing that fresh water down to the lower end of Bayou Lafourche to push up against that saltwater wedge that's continuously trying to get in to combat saltwater intrusion, which is one of the leading causes for some of the land loss rates that we're seeing at the lower end of Bayou Lafourche in Lafourche and Terrebonne parishes. The water starts here from the river. We pump it through these discharge pipes that you see resting on top of the levee, goes underground, and is introduced into the head of Bayou Lafourche, where it then starts flowing south. And from there, we have a
several structures that are strategically positioned along the bayou. We have one in Napoleonville, and we have another in Lockport, which is about 65 miles south of where we're standing now. And the purpose of those structures are to make sure that no matter what, if we have a mechanical failure, if we have electricity issues where the pumps are shut down, if we have a spill in the Mississippi River and we have to shut down for a period of time, we have to utilize those structures to be able to create a reservoir in the bayou for the customers to utilize that source water. So hour by hour, somebody's watching those water surface elevations, coupled with weather forecasts, which make things really difficult because the existing station is pumping at full capacity year-round. We have no redundancy built in to the station, okay? So that's why this new station that's going to be built right behind me is so critical. If a pump goes down, we have the ability at that point to just crank up another pump and life goes on as normal. And the Mississippi River fluctuate drastically throughout the year. And that's what dictates how we run the facility. If you look right behind me, you can see the Batcher is not covered with water, okay? The river's coming up. The river elevation where we are right now today is at about 19 feet, okay? We're expecting it to get up to about 25, 26 feet, which will cover this entire Batcher with water. Okay, that's important to us because as the river comes up, it allows us to siphon our 4 pumps. So these are electric motor driven pumps. So when the river's low, those 4 pumps have to be operated with an electric motor. Why is that important? Is because when we're running on the electric motors, it's a cost to the freshwater district of about $35,000 a month. Okay, so you can see when the river's low, it's a considerable expense just in electricity. Okay, that doesn't deal with salaries, other maintenance, fuel, lube, grease, everything else that goes into running that facility. We at the freshwater district, we certainly welcome a slightly elevated river. We don't like it when it's, you know, all the way to the top of the levee and makes a whole lot of other people nervous. But a nice elevated river like you see now, and even a few feet higher, will allow us to siphon all 4 pumps, which takes us completely off of the dependency on electricity. So we're then producing water from the Mississippi River into Bayou Lafourche at no cost to the freshwater district. Water originates, and remember, this is the same exact water that we pumped from the Mississippi River through our station in Donaldsonville, got to here, and this is where Ginger Rushins with the Assumption Parish Waterworks, she's the plant manager here, takes it from Bayou Lafourche and puts it into the plant, and she can tell you how they go through that process to get it out to the residents from here.
We're pulling the water in from the bottom, and it sucks it up, the pumps suck it up, and then send it directly across the street to the plant where we finish treating it. All the water goes to the same place. The first original one was built in 1959, the second one early 80s, this one probably mid-80s or something, and this one was 2001. And we're in the process of upgrading and possibly putting in another plant. These first 3 can do 2 million gallons of water, treat 2 million gallons of water a day, and the first one's a 1 million gallon plant. We need those because of demand now, how much has changed since the plant was originally built in 1959. Population's increased a bit. Everybody used to have cisterns. They catch rainwater off of their roofs. And there was a small plant in town that pulled from a well, but there isn't, the groundwater is not good enough for us to be able to use here. So Bayou Lafourche is very important because that is our only source of water. Okay, so this is the first step. The raw water comes into each of these units. We have 4 treatment units. They're upflow clarifiers. We've got a center mix that you can see that's where the chemical is, and it's taking the mud out of the water. And then the very top layer of water is being skimmed out, and that's what's being brought into the filters. You can see how all the mud is down in there. And then you can see how much clearer just that one step makes it. Coming out on the outside, you can see how much clearer it is. So the water comes from the outside treatment units into filter galleries. Each treatment unit has 2 filters. At the bottom of these filters, there are filter blocks, but on top of that, there's 18 inches of anthracite and 12 inches of sand, which is the filter media. So the water comes in from the outside, and it slowly goes through the filters. We are one of 4 systems in Louisiana, drinking water systems, that has UV. We treat with UV as well. So the people in our parish have an extra layer of protection when it comes to viruses and bacteria and also chemicals. We're in South Louisiana. We're not really accustomed to having freezing temperatures very often, if ever. This past January, we had temperatures get down in the low 20s, I think. And when that happens, a lot of people's houses here are built up off the ground. So in order to protect their pipes, they drip their faucets. So we went up from sending out about 4.5 million gallons a day to 6.5 million with all the drips and the broken lines after. So that's another reason we're in talks about adding another plant for situations like that.
When you have these freezing conditions, what's the first thing every resident does in a freeze? They start running their pipes. The demand goes through the roof, so you're taking a very vulnerable water system and adding those vulnerabilities on top of it. Living in Louisiana, real hard freezes is something that doesn't happen very often. You know, a 100-year freeze, I hope I never see that again. But we were able to learn a lot. You know, typically when those type of events happen, the river's low. As we discussed earlier, we had both of our water control structures shut because we were pumping as much water as we can. The weather conditions weren't cooperating. We were in a drought. The winds were sustained out of the north for months at a time, which pushes the water out, obviously dropping the water surface elevation in the bayou. And it makes it difficult for the water plants that we are providing service to draw us enough water to meet their demands.
We've got little chemical feed lines coming to these units, just shattered. So we had to get 5-gallon buckets with little pumps on top of them to take the place of the ones we were feeding from the pump room, because all the lines out here were broken, they were frozen, chemical was frozen in the line. It was hell for about 2 weeks.
We have to deal with a considerable amount of sediment just to the south of where we're standing, about a mile south of where the water is introduced into the bayou. What we've done there is we've designed a sediment trap. So it's essentially a section of the bayou. It's about 1,500 feet long, and in that 1,500 feet, the bayou is deeper and wider than the rest of the bayou as you go further south. And the idea is, as the water goes through the railroad bridge and gets into the sediment trap, into this larger area, the velocities slow down and a lot of the heavier material settles out there, so that that's the only, not the only place we have to manage it, but that's the main location we have to manage that sediment. And just about 6 months ago, we did a maintenance dredging project where we pulled out about 30,000 cubic yard of material. And what we did was we put a suction dredge in the bayou, and we strung discharge pipe through the bayou under the highway where we're standing. And the discharge pipe literally ran right where I'm standing now and went out into the river and discharged the sediment back into the Mississippi River. So obviously, as a guy growing up on the bayous in South Louisiana, I would much rather see that sediment being used beneficially further south. But the economies of that just it doesn't work out. It would be so cost prohibitive to take that sediment and transport it 80 miles south where it really, really needs to end up. It doesn't make sense economically. And the velocities and the flow that we're putting into the bayou right now aren't suitable to keep that material suspended those 80 miles. So.
The river flows through us, making us one. We are crabs skirting the borders of the river's stress. We are bridges stepping across the intestine of the Mississippi snake. We fish ourselves out, scale our skin, and eat our own hearts. The mud swirl. Is our skin clayed to perfection by the endless caressing of mud silk? In dry seasons, with cornbread and syrup, we eat the river that washed our feet and combed our hair, curled around our bed, flowing through our dreams. In tears, we cry the river, wet clay, walking down our spine. The river flowing in our veins, red as a chafalaya. The river cleansing keeps us in a state of clay, a sculptural form that bends and moves levees, destroys bridges and weaves palmettos into a sleeping basket for a new clay baby, rocking in our river cradle, waiting to be born of mud and foam. The river pushing her out of the small river womb into the larger river family, uniting us a river culture, fishing our hair into lines, netting our braids into songs. We sing the river. The rhythm unidentified is river roll, river sweat, river mud, river sticks. We are rivers, flowing into each other's basins. How can we wash our hands without flowing into each other?
It's a bit like a very delicate ballet when the ships maneuver past each other. I mean, they can't afford to hit each other, that's for sure. And sometimes that water is running, 8, 12, 10 knots, 8, 9, 10 knots. I have the most enormous respect and have met and ridden with some of the bar pilots up and down the river, which gave me enormous insight into how it works. I've been way down to Pilot Town and stayed down there and documented the boats coming in and out of the very mouth of the river, and ridden on the backs of had to climb up rope ladders out in the Gulf to get onto the stacks of the ships with the bar pilot, and he would take his little laptop computer and just plug it in, and the captain of the ship would stand back, and the guy Pat, he just gives his little finger and he would take the ship up Southwest Pass. That's where all the boats come up Southwest Pass. And they need these special pilots to bring them up. They don't trust the pilots from everywhere else. And they're fascinating fellows. And it goes back, their vocation goes back in their families for years and years and years. So I've learned to respect the river that way, the mechanics of the river.
That's all the stern. That's his stern, moving water, sucking water. Here she comes. But then our sterns are going to suck each other. It's going to check my bow up. Yeah. So we just met. We didn't really do anything. I just midshipped her, right? That was my last command, midship. I hadn't forgotten it. I'm like, let's see what she does. Now we're coming to a portion. It's like we're heading deep into the bend. That's where we want to be. Yes. You can look on your active chart. You'll see. Yes. You know, see down there around the next point is the next dredge, which we're going to leave on our starboard side. Okay. And just because of where it is, we're not going to reduce speed anymore because we're coming around a point, and I don't want to be reducing revolutions and losing steering. So we're just going to maintain full maneuvering. We're not going to do any damage to them with this speed. We're not throwing a swell. We're moving a little water. We'll give them a heads up. Sure. Okay? Sure. So we'll be going by him. We give him a call here. We'll be going by him in about 15 minutes. Yep. Dredge, Captain Frank, P12.
Captain Frank.
Well, Captain, downbound, coming down on light 22. Got 42 feet of draft. We'll be by you in about 15 minutes on 2 whistles. Thank you, sir. And after that, I think we have 1 inbound ship coming in. One of our pilots on board. So once we get by the dredge, get that 1 inbound ship, it'll be fine. Okay. And nothing's changed as far as the leak. The weather out there. The same. Yes. Okay. Great. Southwest. South.
The inbound chute is not going to be near the dredge, right?
Oh, no. It'll be well below the dredge. We'd be more worried about meeting him near the lighthouse. Well, we have surveys that are updated this time of year every day. The Corps of Engineers is out every day with the boats, surveying the bottom. And I made sure to review the problem areas that always arise. You'll see there's a pipeline dredge up ahead that we're going to go by. That's one of the typical areas where they start dredging, and there might be a little bit of shoaling on the bank. But everywhere throughout the channel right now with this draft, if you keep her in the middle, she's going to be just fine. But you have room for air on either side of the center line, so we got plenty of water for us right now.
Mm-hmm. The pilot, he is an expert in this particular area, so he has got the expertise, and we need to believe him. And when we come inside, we just tell about the vessel, that how the vessel is going to, how the vessel behaves, and what are the difficulties or what are the problems, if at all, with the vessel. And then he takes over from there, because he's a local guy. He understands what characteristics of the water over here. Then all the things he can judge correctly, which we as a master, even as a 10 years master, I will not be able to judge.
Dealing with. So what our pilot knows, what he's looking at when he looks at this water, he can see the contour of the bottom. So it would be like if I showed you a three-dimensional survey, you would see what he sees already. So, but keep in mind that the rocks is not the area that he can pilot this ship in. He's limited to about a 600 to 750 foot width in this channel. He has to know exactly where those dimensions are to keep this ship from going aground. Because again, just like a draft reduction, if a ship goes aground, it's going to cost millions of dollars to rectify that situation. Great. So what scares me when I look out is when I look out and I don't see much land anymore, much marsh. I see the Gulf of Mexico creeping up on us very closely. But in turn, I can look over here further to the east and see where there's been some coastal restoration done this year. I don't know if you can pan up and pick that up with the sand. So while we spend so much time working on funding for dredging and finding dredging equipment, working with the Corps of Engineers, with our legislative delegations, is to make sure that we have adequate funding, adequate equipment to maintain the channel to 45 feet. Because whenever we have to recommend a lower draft, say 42 feet, a ship that may have loaded in China 30 days ago headed to the Mississippi River is now going to be caught because it's 3 feet deeper than we can allow it to come in the river. It's going to cost that shipper or that ship owner millions of dollars to either light load that ship or wait till the dredging takes effect and we can raise the draft back up to 45 feet. And how that works is our pilots that are down here on station, they make those recommendations. They huddle up together since they live and work together at all times. They talk about this on a daily basis, and they will lower or raise the draft depending on what the conditions are based upon surveys, and actually also what they're experiencing out here on the ships. Because a lot of times what they feel out here on the ship, they'll see in the survey the next day. So electronics do play a big part of our job today, but it's still a hands-on job where you are looking out the window and you're going by your experiences and the other pilots' experiences while they're out there with you on the river.
You know, we go out beyond the sea buoy. We stay on, or we get on as early as possible, or we stay on as long as possible to make sure that this ship is safe. So just because we go by the sea buoy doesn't mean, okay, see you later, Captain, you're on your own. That's just, we're held to a higher standard than that. Right. So I always, I try to stress to the captain that I'm not going to get off until he's comfortable. And if he's not comfortable, I'm not going anywhere. He hasn't released me, So, on paper it's the sea buoy, but it's the surrounding area.
So we have.
Yeah, they'll be out here.
You coming back, Real? The biggest I ever caught is about 25 pounds. That's about a 4 or 5 pound. That's an eel cat, they call it, because you can tell by the color. Yeah. Now, here comes some of those. Let me pick it. I can pick it. Every piece of shad I own, I use. I got 5 pounds, 4 or 5 pounds.
That guy caught about four shads right here. By the size of that there.
Yeah.
Right here.
That's the eel cat. I'm at the dock. That's the eel cat there.
I don't know what it is. I know you're catching me.
You know, but we make the stink bait, or we use worms, you know, and we make the stink bait. It consists of Kool-Aid, strawberry Kool-Aid, or red Kool-Aid, or red Jello, and cayenne pepper and garlic, and you mix that together and put on beef or chicken, and you know it. Yeah, you can fish out here sometimes 4 or 5 hours. Don't catch a thing. Sometimes, like this guy here, when they had the shad, every time he throw out about 5 minutes, he bring in one.
What do you think about this?
He done caught. Doc, how many most you caught at one time? About 30? About 30? About 30. And that was 15 to 40, 50 pounders.
They were rescue me up. I'm all over the world. They had a dude filming me. He picked me all over the world. I'm famous. I'm famous. What's the name of this river?
Mississippi.
That's why I'm from Mississippi. This is mine.
The river was always a part of my life. When I was born near the river, across from the levee on River Road, delivered by the midwife, and that was all we knew when I was growing up, was just the levee in front of us, the river behind the levee, and behind us was the railroad track. And the people, the only strangers we knew were the hobos who got off the train, and would come by my grandmother's house and ask for some little food, and she would feed them. She would give them some biscuit and syrup. And then they would go on their way, catch the train, and continue. And also, when I was growing up, Mr. West, who was known as the Gown Man, he used to preach on the river. He lived on the river. And I used to see him, and we were all scared of him because he wore white, all white, and he had a stick, a cross wrapped in white cloth. And we called him the Gown Man, but he was really the river preacher. So he would preach to the hobos and things like that. And I always wondered what his life was like living on the river like that, because he just kind of caught what he could, ate, you know, wild berries and stuff, and then he would stop in the neighborhood and get food from different people in the neighborhood. Everybody knew him. And my grandfather used to fish the river, and he would catch all different kinds of fish that sometimes Mommy wouldn't eat it because she thought it was strange. And he would catch wild birds and bring it. That was our food, you know, other than the meat we would buy, but we didn't buy meat that often. So everything kind of came from the river, the fish.
You know, Woody, you're rightfully known as the grandfather, first the father, now the grandfather of coastal concerns in Louisiana.
The first thing we did was challenge a long-standing belief that the Delta was still building land, that the land was growing every year. And also, we launched on measuring land loss for the first time, and determined that at the end of the day, we studied maps from 1890 to 1960, about the last edition that was available, and we determined that the land loss rate was 16.5 square miles per year. I was raised in the Carrollton Bend area of New Orleans, about 1 block from the Mississippi River. And at the same place is the reservation of the New Orleans District Corps of Engineers. And by coincidence, both the Corps and this wonderful old preacher that I'm going to tell you about wound up in the same place in the same time. And I learned a lot of lessons about life being there, watching the Corps fleet fix the bateau and stop erosion, and later obtaining topographic maps for 25 cents from the Corps to go out and find places where there were prehistoric Indian sites and stuff like that. You know, and my whole career was really intertwined with things that the Corps did, projects that they designed, tours on the Mississippi to the high water inspections and the low water inspections. But the other thing I want to tell you about is at this same place there was a wonderful old black man who was a preacher, a self-styled preacher from Reserve, Louisiana. He grew up in a small community on the river, and he had a mission in life to convert people to Christianity and to baptize them. And every evening he would go down to Canal and Canal Street and Rampart and preach. He had a robe that he wore. It was fashioned by himself from white sheets. He carried a cross and a tambourine and a Bible. And I actually saw him do this more than once. He would go down and preach, you know, to anyone who would listen, and invite those who were interested to come up to Carrollton in the river, and he would baptize them and save them. And he came every morning, hot weather and cold weather, and he prayed. He'd go out and kneel in the river and pray. And he recognized, like people around the world who live in big river deltas, that there was something sacred about the place. And to me, he has become the icon for the Mississippi River Delta system in Louisiana. Unfortunately, he's deceased now, but you know, he left a lifelong impression on me. We would sit down on a log, and he would tell stories and tell me about what he believed and didn't believe, and I kept contact with him all the way through college. But you know, people who live in deltas appreciate deltas. They're rich in resources and opportunities, and I dare say, you know, if you classified and looked at the natural systems of North America, the Mississippi River would be at the top of the list for its contribution to resources and benefits, but also as a place to live, as a platform for human activity. All our social and economic structure is wrapped around this delta system. And I think it's important that we know that. You know, it's part of our heritage, and it's part of the reason why we can't allow that natural system to be degraded and to collapse.
You know, deltas are huge landscapes. They're very remote at the end of big major rivers. They are very hard to study. They're very hard to get to. And so here we have a laboratory that we're able to get out to and study and frequently look at, make observations with very sophisticated equipment. And it represents an active delta. In other words, it represents a delta that's still connected to its river. All the other coastal basins in the Mississippi River Delta are disconnected. We call them inactive coastal basins. And so if you want to know how to rebuild a delta, you need to understand how to make these coastal basins active. And that's what we have here in the Atchafalaya, and particularly in the Wax Lake Delta. This region in the Atchafalaya Bay is connected to the Atchafalaya River, and that is connected to the Mississippi River, as well as the Red River. And so the combined Mississippi River and Red River, 30% of the combined flow of those two rivers, 30% of that flows down the Atchafalaya into Atchafalaya Bay, which produces the delta growth that we've been observing since 1974 at about 1 to 2 square kilometers per year. Old River Control Structure is what enables that. And that was built to keep the Mississippi River where it is, so it would continue to flow by Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It wasn't built to build a delta. But the sediment that comes down the Atchafalaya from the Mississippi and from the Red River is sufficient. And about 20% of it, deposits before that water gets to the Gulf of Mexico, and that's what builds land.
I mean, you mostly have, in the top part of the water column, you mostly have like fine sediment. And it's one of those things where when you look at it, it doesn't look like much, but when you go to filter to see how much sediment is in the water, your filter will get clogged up quickly and take a while. So you have quite a bit of sediment actually in this water. Yeah, you know, like Wax Lake compared to, Wax Lake's like the living delta. Like you can feel the life about it. It's like, it smells alive, it looks alive. You can see the birds and hear things moving around all the time in a way that, unfortunately, a lot of Louisiana, it feels different. You see things grow and change here in a positive way. Rather than something disappearing over time, you see growth. You see us gaining land. It's pretty amazing.
There's 3 different sensors that they're testing, and those sensors are measuring 3 very important parts of what enables deltas to survive. And that is the water flow, and really the key there is the water that flows from the channel up into the wetlands. And then the second is the sediment concentration that those waters carry, because that's actually one of the most important parts of delta growth, is having sedimentation. And then third is the vegetation. The third sensor is to look at the vegetation, understand the growth of the vegetation, because that vegetation also contributes to the growth of a delta. So all 3 of those are important elements, and we're able to look at the entire delta and understand what is happening and enabling this delta to grow each year.
How old is this? 1985, I think, or 82? 82, I think it's 82. And the islands we just passed were 1974. We could take you to places where it's just emerged in the last couple of years, particularly since we've had major floods. It doesn't grow the same rate every year. These deltas grow when you get the big river pulses.
So I'm a sedimentologist, so sediment's sort of my first love. I was always a dirty kid, much to my mother's chagrin. But here in Louisiana, sediment is the name of the game and tells us a lot about our environment, what's happened, and maybe what will happen. So right now we're taking a core that'll just kind of give us a peek of what's happening just below the surface of the marsh. In
So there's a we think a very interesting sort of combination of, you know, sedimentation and laying down the mud banks, but the vegetation is critical to holding that mud bank and anchoring it, but it all depends on timing. You got a timing of when the floods and the plants are in unison, if you will.
So here we kind of have a snapshot. This is the bottom of the core. This is the oldest part of this, and then as we get a little closer, as we get to the top, this is the newer deposition that's happened. You see a lot of the root systems in this upper part. So this is kind of like when the baby island was forming. You know, this is an area that's built by river floods, when the river is high and bringing sediment down from places like Minnesota and Iowa. It makes its way down here. It can build land, get up on the marshes.
NASA's mission is to use its sensors that they put on satellites to solve problems on Earth. And to do that, one of the problems that they are looking at is whether deltas around the world are surviving or not, given the way that the rivers are changing, particularly with the sediment delivery. So we're out here at Mississippi River Delta. And what we learn here and the calibrations that we do related to linking observations on the ground with what the sensors are seeing up in the sky, once we can build those connections and use modeling to predict the future of deltas, then this will be applied to deltas around the world. So we talk about a feedback of, you know, the sediment deposition builds elevation, and so as the elevation is increases, we call it elevation capital. You can almost think about it as you know, capital investments of any kind of business. You know, out here the infrastructure of these ecosystems, that elevation capital is what really builds the plants that you see. So the green infrastructure that you're looking at out here is built on this foundation of mineral sediment deposition, but then the plants themselves feed back into helping build that elevation. And so it's and that gives it, you know, stability.
One thing that always strikes me coming out here is that, you know, it's not just about like the hard solid land. That's good and serves like really great purpose, but it's also about these little areas. This is like such a productive thing where you have, you know, fish can get, especially like as a fish nursery, the young fish can get into these grasses and kind of hide from predators. Like, it's not just about having the like good solid land. That's good, but you also want to have this kind of diversity and difference in elevation. That's what makes the delta like the living, breathing delta.
And so it is a story of an active delta. It is a story about what land building can occur when you have a river with its sediment connected to the coastal zone. And it is a story to understand the benefits of having an active delta growing because of the communities like Morgan City and Franklin and the people in this area and the infrastructure. They're protected by 10 miles of wetlands that were there in 1932 and before that, and they're still there today. And they're there today because of the river.
And we would run up the levee when we were little, and then run down the levee, and just kind of run up and down the levee, and then we would look at the river, and we would make up songs about the river. So it always fascinated me that this, you know, that all this water was there, and I never felt afraid of it. I just felt it was just so amazing to me. And when I grew up, you know, we would sometimes come back and visit the river. That was something to do, you know, on a Sunday. You come back and you go up the levee, walk down and just stare at the river. And that caused me to want to write about it. So I wrote a lot of poems about the river and about growing up near the river and all of that, because it was like something that was special to me. So the river just kind of lived in me all the time. It was always a part of my life because I was so enamored with it. And the fact that it gave us so much. And it saddened me when they started turning it into a dump for chemicals, and you know, all these plants started sprouting up, and then the trees started dying. And the river, to me, they took something away from the river. And I understood that, you know, some of the stuff they do was necessary, but it was like it wasn't the same river. It's like she became old, and she kind of hanging in there. But she was young and fresh and beautiful when I was little. That was
Enigmatic Stream, the exhibit, is organized entirely geographically. It starts at mile marker 83, which is 83 miles as the river flows above head of passes. So at this point, you're at Chalmette, Lower Algiers. As you come around clockwise, viewing the exhibit, when you get to mile marker 95, through here, you're in the New Orleans area. You keep going upriver. As you reach mile marker 107, just ahead here, you're now in Jefferson Parish, and you're beginning to approach St. Charles Parish, which is the next upriver parish. At mile marker 122, you're now in St. Charles and in the area of Norco, which is an important industrial node along the river because that's where the Bonnie Carey Spillway is, and all of the plants at Norco are there. As you keep coming, there's a little bit of a jump up to the Gramercy-Lutcher area at mile marker 147 at the Veterans Memorial Bridge. And at this point, you need to wrap around the backside of the dividing wall to complete the journey upriver. At mile marker 167, you're at about the Sunshine Bridge near Donaldsonville. And then as you continue upriver to mile marker 230, and finally mile marker 234, you're now at Baton Rouge. And that's the upper end of the geographic range that this project covers. It's 151 miles as the river flows. Okay. Right. Enigmatic Stream is a somewhat cryptic title. I think the subtitle reveals what the project is really all about, and that's industrial landscapes of the lower Mississippi River. And it's meant to be all of industry. It is bridges, levees, spillways, granaries, oil refineries, petrochemical plants, alumina plants, wood pellet plants, lumber mills. It's all of it, and it's much more varied than you would typically think. When you think of this section, this industrial corridor of the river, most people are thinking refineries and petrochemical plants, but it's much, much more than that. And I was interested in all of that infrastructure. I dedicated this to human ingenuity, the beautiful wildness of nature, and the conflict between the two. Conflict is the key word here. You see a lot of conflict. There is the conflict inherent in the engineered status of the river and flood control and what aspects that has created for South Louisiana to deal with. There's also this conflict between residential use and industrial use of the river corridor. There's conflict between industry and nature, and you see that all over the place. And you also see the conflict between life on the river and the normal kind of movement and navigation that we need with the river itself, which is both a highway and a moat. was always after juxtaposition in these photographs, because I love to show a technology that we all take for granted and the infrastructure that supports it underneath. Here is, for me, an interesting juxtaposition. I'm photographing a cow pasture in the foreground. This is near Donaldsonville, near the Sunshine Bridge. And this appears to be a sort of a contradictory juxtaposition, where all of this in the background seems to have nothing to do with what's in the foreground. But it's actually all agriculture, because what's happening in the background here is there's a fertilizer plant under construction, and then you have the cow pasture in the foreground. So very different forms of agriculture, but that's what is happening, foreground and background in this particular case. It's another one here I wanted to point out, just know if you all can use it, but to me, this is the most jarring juxtaposition in the book, and it's the concluding image in the book. It is geographically positioned in the exhibit, of course, but this is Taft, Louisiana, and the Holy Rosary Cemetery in Taft. Taft doesn't exist anymore. The Union Carbide plant is now where the town used to be. Even the church has been moved. The only thing that's left is the cemetery, and that's all there is at Taft today. And literally everyone who is sightseeing going up and down the river road, when they see this, they stop and take a picture. They take their version of it. It's such a dramatic juxtaposition that it literally is lost on no one. Always the lower middle class and working class housing. The wealthy are not living in such close proximity. And that's another issue that you have to cope with in Louisiana, is this jostling for position on the high ground along the river is causing things that normally would be separated more, perhaps, to be in close proximity. And the high ground that follows the river, everybody's jostling to be on that high ground. So there's more competition for the land use, and that's one factor. The other thing being a lot of this industry is in rural areas. Here's a juxtaposition I would also like to talk about. This is in Chalmette, where you have a very modest ranch house with an SUV in the driveway, and literally in the backyard of the house is the Valero refinery. But what's interesting here is the suburban lifestyle is pervasively popular. It has been for decades, and it is the most popular lifestyle choice. And it requires this infrastructure. The thing about suburbia is you do kind of need to drive everywhere. You don't walk too many places, and uses aren't mixed, really. So you drive. It's based on automobile mobility. And how is that achieved? You need gasoline for that. So this is a rare case where the lifestyle and the infrastructure that supports that lifestyle can be seen all in one view. These are rural parishes and unincorporated areas, so it's actually more haphazard than you would think, because the normal things that you go through with city planning and so forth in urban areas and incorporated areas, even if it's small towns, if they're incorporated, then you have additional layer of bureaucracy controlling what can be put where. But when you're out in rural Louisiana, there are less rules. for things like grain and oil that we're using massive amounts of, the river is still the best way to move those products around. If you want to be green, if you want to move large amounts of heavy things around in the most energy efficient way, floating on a barge is still the most efficient way to do it anymore. My approach with this project is I just wanted to hold up the mirror so that people could see this landscape, they could see the industry. I think it's quite self-evident, all the issues that are going on and a lot of the conflict that is happening. We all know about global warming, and it's the topic of our time, really. There are other issues as well. There's the engineered status of the river and how that's affecting coastal Louisiana and the dissolution of the coast. It's exacerbated by global warming, but it's really a separate issue. And then, of course, we have the issue of proximity of living close to these plants. And how good an idea is that? How much is it affecting the population? Not the people that work in the plants, but the people that live at the fence line. These are all issues that are shown, but not expressly, overtly discussed. This is a future of the past, and a fairly recent past, but it's something now that we just take for granted. It's there. And just like the sugar refineries have been there for decades and decades, we don't think of it as representing the future anymore. We still need sugar. But we just take it for granted now as something that has always been there and will always be there. And so in some of these cases, I was looking at these landscapes as historical landscapes, things that represented the future a half-century ago. The way that I describe this, I think the river road between New Orleans and Baton Rouge has always had a fraught history. There's the history of cane farming and the manufacture of sugar and the slavery that went along with that, and then the heavy industry comes along in the aftermath of that, and they all are a very complex, complicated story, where the risk versus reward and the exploitation by man of his fellow man is a big part of the story, and it's never been pretty or idyllic. We look back on the cane farming in the 18th and 19th centuries and the grand plantation houses and so forth, and we have this myopic view that that was the idyllic period of the river before the heavy industry got here. But in fact, since slavery supported it, I mean, how idyllic was that? It wasn't at all. In fact, you could make the argument that that was more problematic and was more stressful to society and dealing with the complications and the resolution and ultimately the abolition of slavery, which involved the Civil War.
We believe that history is important, and that it's important that we tell our own stories, that we dig deep in what happened in our community to tell the most compelling things about our past. Our challenge is to just always do better every day, to dig deeper, to tell better stories. Just when we think we've got something figured out, another artifact or another piece of history will walk into the museum, and sends us on another path and another way of investigating or interpreting. Or we just always got to ask ourselves: is this the story we want to tell to today's children? Is this the history that we want remembered? So it's important, for example, when we do our Slavery to Civil Rights tour, which tours these cabins here, that we're telling our local stories, our stories of resistance, of freedom, of education, of the things that were going on that are more compelling. We don't want it to just be, the tragedy. And you can get traumatized when you live this history, when you talk about this history day in and day out. It's something that we talk about in our staff, that this can really be re-traumatizing for people to live and experience every day. And so we also want to be sure to tell those good stories of survival, of resistance, of the quest for freedom, of those that stood up against others in their time to speak the truth.
Local stories are national stories.
Oh yes, the local stories always weave into the national, but when you're talking about national stories, it's so much more abstract. But when you can really say, nope, right here, this case, this happened in Louisiana, this was right here in your backyard, it really brings the national narrative home.
One of the things that I say to our visitors when I'm trying to get them to understand the geography and the demographics of this area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is that the landscape is black community, sugarcane field, tourism plantation house, petrochemical plant. Black community, sugarcane field, petrochemical company, plantation tourism house. This land of sugarcane plantations is now the land of the petrochemical industry. And we struggle with trying to survive still in this land that was foreign to us when we were brought upriver from New Orleans and ended up working here on the plantations. Now, many times, the only option that young people have when they graduate from high school is to go to work in the petrochemical industry. I live here in this region of South Louisiana on the Mississippi River, where I say that sugar was king. Some like to say that cotton was king and sugar was queen. But for me, sugar was king. Sugar was like gold. Sugar is tied to blood for me when I think about it, because I think about all of the pain and suffering and the lash to keep people working to produce more sugar, to produce more money. I also think about sugar in terms that the enslaved people and my ancestors who lived on this river, who worked at the plantations, provided the free labor that contributed to the economy and culture, not only the economy and culture of this parish, but the economy and culture of this state, the economy and culture of this nation, and their free labor contributed to the economy and culture of this world.
This place is a beast. You know, you call it Puff the Magic Dragon when you pass on the highway and you see all the smoke billowing out of the smokestacks. And it takes a lot of cane, a lot of infrastructure to support grinding that amount of cane and making sugar. And there's a lot of people in this area that depend on the sugar industry for a source of income. I know I was raised, my father was a sugar farmer. Like I said, for 8 generations, my family has pretty much been raised from sugar. And there's a lot of other families in this area that work at different factories. You know, the farmers make money and they spend it in town for parts on their tractors and everything else. But it's a big industry. I think the whole industry wide is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Impact for Louisiana, about $3 billion, maybe. I've heard the latest, but you know, when you look at that, I mean, it's massive to South Louisiana. Our sugar that we produce here, most of it is, majority of it is sold to Domino's, which they refine it into white sugar, and some of it goes to Lacasine, to the Bayou Rum distillery, and they turn sugar into the next best thing, which is a bourbon or a rum.
Yeah, there's approximately 11 mills. We have a relationship with most of those mills. Some we get more than others, but we have very strong working relationship with the mills in Louisiana. We ship 125 different products out of here. That includes liquid sugar, that includes bulk sugar, that's packets and cubes and 4 and 10 pound bags, that's super sacks. That also includes liquid products that are specific to bakers, special formulations for them. We have a proprietary product called the co-crystallized. It's basically pourable brown sugar that we make. And we'll sell some that's highly refined for pharmaceuticals, for spirit manufacturers. We work with Patu extensively. And most of the sugar we get comes in by barges. So we'll get a couple of barges a day. We'll unload a couple of barges a day. They're going to be about 3 million pounds a barge. That's the equivalent of about 50 truckloads of product if it came in by road. That is raw sugar. So the product that the mills are producing is raw sugar. It's not a foodstuff yet. We're going to take that, we're going to refine it, take out whatever impurities are left and turn it into an edible foodstuff. Refining cane sugar is both science and an art. The art is what we haven't figured out to write an equation about yet. And eventually we'll figure that out, and it'll be less and less art and more science. Here, this is one of the better technical refineries that there is, and so a big part of what we do now we consider to be science. Part of the reason that we are so good at the science of refining is some of the very technically capable people that we've had that have been here for years studying not just sugar refining, but the Chalmette refinery, and understanding how do you adjust the equipment to be very efficient at producing good quality granulated sugar.
This sequence of jars gives you an idea of the various products and byproducts produced in the sugarcane industry, beginning with bagasse and raw sugarcane juice and ending with raw sugar. And we're at the West Baton Rouge Museum in Port Allen, which is essentially devoted to the history of the sugarcane industry in Louisiana. We're unofficially known as the Sugar Museum. They made some initial attempts to grow the sugarcane in Louisiana. For whatever reason, it wasn't quite as successful as some of the other cash crops like indigo and tobacco. It wasn't until they started crystallizing the sugar with the Jamaica train system that it really took off as a cash crop. Largely overseen by Etienne de Boré, who was the first to crystallize sugar using the Jamaica train process, and he did it in New Orleans on his plantation, which is now the location of the Audubon Zoo.
Sugar was extremely labor intensive from the aspect of a day being 16 hours. So you're thinking that from the time you're up in the morning before daylight to walk into the fields, you're working a 16-hour day. After leaving the fields, sometimes you would go and work in the mill. If you look at the names on the list that we have here from the Homer's House plantation, you will also see the word implined or badly implined. And when I first saw that inventory list, I immediately went to the dictionary looking for the word implined, spelled E-M-P-L-I-N-E-D. Couldn't find it anywhere. And I talked to an anthropologist at LSU who had done extensive research on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean and here in Louisiana. And he He said the only place he ever saw that word used is in the slave inventories on sugarcane plantations, and it meant missing fingers or appendages. Because you're working very fast with that machete and that cane knife, the machinery and conveyor belts in the refineries sometimes would catch your fingers, or you're working very fast. And so that meant missing an appendage or missing a finger, usually caused by that cane knife.
Until relatively recent times, sugarcane was harvested by hand. These are a variety of specialized tools that were used in the harvest, but the quintessential tool was the cane knife. Now, workers would harvest each stalk individually in 3 motions. First, they would chop at the bottom to remove the stalk from the roots. They would chop a second time at the top to remove the tuft of leaves that comes out the top of a sugarcane stalk. Then they would reverse the cane knife to use the hook on the back. They would pass that hook down the sugarcane stalk to strip the leaves along the sides. Only then was the stalk ready to be sent to the mill for grinding. So each individual stalk was cut by hand this way into the 1940s and 50s. It was extremely labor intensive. So imagine that your workday was 10 to 12 hours of these repetitive motions, chopping the stalk at the bottom and top, flipping the knife, and stripping the stalk over and over and over again all day long.
So when we talk about the industrialization of sugar, you know, here in Louisiana, I think first of Norbert Rillieux, who invented the vacuum pan process for crystallizing sugar in 1843. And we say that he is the father or the founder of chemical engineering. He created that process, removing the process of boiling that hot syrup and melting down that sugar in those big sugar kettles, where it was hand ladled by enslaved people from one large, if you can imagine, an 8-foot in diameter kettle, 6-foot in diameter kettle, 5-foot in diameter kettle, ladling that hot syrup that had an open fire under each kettle. You can imagine if you've ever made candy before, or if you've ever made any type of icing where you had to melt sugar on a stove. If you've ever had that hot liquid hit your skin, you can imagine what it must have been like for those men and women who might have been shirtless, without shoes, that open fire, coals, hot coals rolling toward their feet. There was no OSHA then, I tell young people.
The Jamaica train method was the primary means of sugar production until the whole process was revolutionized by Norbert Rillieux. He was a free person of color born in New Orleans, but he was educated in Paris at the Polytechnic Institute in France. And what he did was he decided that the sugar production methods needed to be modernized. He was from early on very interested in steam and the use of steam in chemical processes, and decided to apply this to sugar production. So he developed these vacuum pan and evaporator machines to produce sugar to replace the Jamaica train method. The Jamaica train method, as we said earlier, was dangerous, extremely labor-intensive, and time-consuming. And Norbert believed that he could do it better.
When Norbert Rillieux created this process for crystallizing sugar with his evaporator pan, it was now a system where he captured the steam in these 3 apparatus and recycled that steam into energy. And so there was no longer a need for those open kettles and that hand labor.
Absolutely succeeded.
So,
his process was hugely successful, hugely influential, and in fact is still being used today in multiple industries, not only the sugarcane industry. The basic process that he devised is still in place. It's been much updated and is now hugely computerized, but the essential mechanics of what he imagined are still being used. His other idea was that they could reuse the bagasse. Bagasse is the fibery materials left over, and so this bagasse, these fibery materials, were put right back into the process by being burned in the boilers. And so the fiber was used to heat the juice. The sugar.
One of the byproducts is bagasse. And what bagasse is after all the water and moisture and sugar is crushed out of the sugar cane. Yep. It's like almost like a powdery, fibrous substance. That is what we burn in the boilers. We're pretty much 100% energy sustainable burning bagasse. There's very little natural gas that we have to burn to supplement our power supply. So that's an important part of what we do in being able to run our factory off of the byproduct of our crop.
It made it hugely efficient, much more cost effective. It required much less workforce, and it was much safer. And it made waves. It fueled an entire era of massive sugarcane production that Louisiana hadn't known before that.
Right, so you have to think about this too. So now we're in this era after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. Dr. Laurie and this benevolent society come along, and they realized that blacks needed to be more self-sufficient, or you had to be self-sufficient. You have to think about it. There was no Red Cross. There was no welfare. So you had to be self-sufficient. There were no white insurance companies that were going to insure you. So they buy this plantation and create a farm where they're growing food, and they're also growing sugarcane, and then they find oil. Oil is found. The Calcasieu oil field finds oil on their property. And so the Benevolent Society starts to reap some of the benefits from these oil, the residuals of, of the oil. And it's really amazing how African Americans were so self-sufficient. And there was a time before there was so much government assistance that people had to take care of themselves and take care of each other. And it really warms my heart to see the names of these benevolent societies, Shining Star, Loving Sisters of Charity, Bright Sunshine in the Morning, benevolent societies, all up and down this river in some of these communities that were called free towns. The first communities right next to the plantations along this river and along the bayou. Every now and then you'll come across a little town that's called or referred to as Freetown because it was the first settlement of the people who stayed and did not leave once emancipation came. And so
the Patus originally came from France to grow grapes. It didn't work too well, so we ended up growing sugarcane. The rest is history, because we are one of the largest processors in the state of sugarcane. This is brown sugar. It looks kind of white, but that's sugar in the raw. Our sugar that we produce here, the majority of it is sold to Domino's, which they refine it into white sugar.
The refinery here processes 7 million pounds of raw sugar a day.
On any one given day, we process about 20,000 tons of cane, and that equates to about 800 trucks from Opelousas to Monkey area, around the Franklin area, that all come over here to process that cane.
The Louisiana farmers are doing a better and better job at getting yield per acre. We're seeing that as a pretty robust cane crop the last couple of years, and I think that's been a fairly steady trend. Land loss here would be, if it's a threat to cane growing, it's a threat to us because we're very closely tied to the fields and to the mills in Louisiana. And so as they go, we go.
We don't have anywhere to go as far as the sugarcane industry. We can't go up to higher ground because that's where the subdivisions are going. You know, so we pushed back to all these little low-lying areas and on the coastline, place where nobody wants to live. That's where we at now, and we have to protect our coast to have a sustainable industry. I'm the 8th generation. I want 8 more after me. You know, hopefully my kids will want to do this, carry it another generation, and we need to protect our coast so that they can have that opportunity.
It's a lot of history on this river.
All a year ago, I've had the chance to revisit the river as a theme for my paintings, which I have been painting for 35 years. I come and go from it. There's a beautiful park called the Crescent City Park right down the street from here, and I ride up and down it every afternoon when I can, and I started taking my sketchbook and my little iPhone and immediately started recording the river again, just instinctively. I grew up on the water, and the movement of the water and the boats is really what I love to paint a lot of the time. And so I'm working on a body of work, calling it The River Turns. I've done some big paintings already for it, and they're down from sea level. And it's a real thrill again to be working with the river. Right now, as we speak, the river's running really fast and it's high. All kind of stuff is running through it, detritus, all kind of stuff. I love to sketch the boats as they're moving around the bend. The movement of the boats coming around the bend is one of the most beautiful sweeps, and I love to try and catch that in my drawings and things. And this studio I'm in now is a little single shotgun house in the Marigny. And I lived next door, and my studio for many years was upstairs. And I used to have a view of the ships coming down through the rooftops. The stacks of the ships would move through the rooftops, which was always fun to try and sketch that too. But the river has an enormous presence here. I mean, everybody is just so conscious of the river. It's commercially, it's a commercial thing, but it's the sound of the river, the sound living here. You hear the sound of the river all of the time, the different sounds, the boats and when you go down to the park now, it's peopled. For so long, there was no access to the turn in the river here, and you couldn't get to it. You could, but you're always chased off by security. Now there's all these people. There's a wonderful park, and there's roller skating, and they're having picnics, and they're enjoying a very, very nice experience by the river. The river has been opened up to the public, which has made this neighborhood really a whole new dimension for us, which has been really good. Also, as an artist, you know, making shapes and creating compositions and making marks on canvas and on paper. You really have to make your own thing work for you. You can't just... Nature's really mean-spirited. Nature rarely gives you a picture. It will now and then, but very rarely. You have to do something. You just can't go down and say, you have to do something. You have to challenge it. You have to do something. Turn it around, turn it upside down, add something to it, do something to it, make it, and then bring it back again. That's the artist's job, not just to illustrate it. That's not my job, is not to illustrate the river, it's to paint it. That sounds contradictory. But painting and illustration, and they interflow. As a painter, you're at the raw edge, cutting edge of original stuff. This is not an illustration. This is a composition. It's not meant it's not meant to sell anything or anything like that. It is what it is. Actually, this little composition is called the Downtown Turn. It's this confluence of things. It's very dense. Sometimes I like to spread things out a lot, you know, space with space, and make big space in paintings. But this is really dense. And, you know, so being an artist, it's very challenging to have the river because it's flat. I've said this before. It's flat. It's unforgiving. It's mean. It's ugly. It's rough. It's a real bitch. But I love her, and she's been my muse for 35 years. How about that?
So I lived in a totally different world for 33 years, including years before with my dad. But what also makes it very strange for me is running out here when I would wait for a ship, and sometimes the agent would call us and say, okay, it's going to be 2 in the morning, and you wake up, and then he'd call you and say, oh no, it's late, 3 o'clock. So if I was already there, I would go for a run on the river. And the river is, even as polluted as it is, right here, I've seen otters, I've seen beaver, pelicans, ducks. It's just amazingly resilient even after every polluter from Canada to here dumps everything in it. And so running along it added to this sense of being in another world. I ran 2 races up above Manresa and St. Gabriel, 100 miles to New Orleans. So you're along the river for 24 hours running along, and it gets real strange. It really gets strange. Because you're not in modern society. The river really, it has modern ships, and it has all of the modern terminals, but it's not modern at all. And that, to me, it really grounds me, makes me feel like I can hold on a little longer. It's amazing. I don't know how to really convey the surreal magic and serenity that it. But to go back to how it's a different world when you're on one side of the river going to work to get the ship, or on the other side of the river, it's a different world. The 2 sides are completely separate, especially when you go down to Pilot Town and the water and the land are not separate. If I'm up, about 5 stories high in the officer's deck looking out, there's no real separation between the Gulf, the lakes, the river, the water. the land. It's all one thing. And the feeling that gives you is nothing like you experience driving your car on the interstate. It's nothing like that. There's no, I don't know how people live like we do. Because how could they have given this up, this life on the river and in the swamps? And even down south, all of the tugboat guys, the launch operators, they all spoke French. So you worked in America, which was really magical. It was just wonderful. And the other thing that just amazes me is our sort of modern concept is that the river all comes down. It all flows down to the Gulf. And they bring the coal barges down from Ohio and West Virginia. But that's not all it is. It goes both ways. We just saw the grain ship going up. And it doesn't even have that kind of direction. It's like flows both ways, even though the water is going one way. Although I went into the Corps of Engineers back when you could go in there, and I asked them, I said, hey, do you have any books on the river, what y'all do? And they said, oh yeah, and he reached in his bottom drawer, sold me 2 books they had written. And basically, after reading them, I got the idea, they basically said, we have no clue. Everything we've done has been wrong. And if a river goes like this, they cut it off, and it doesn't go that way. You know.
So I'm all about trying to lean into that and trying to figure out what it is to be a person whose land has been washed away, whose homeland has been washed away. So I think about it a lot, and I think about water so much, and water is just in every piece of art that I do. I felt really hopeless for a long time, especially after making Locked and Homeland Wetland, because I sort of did a deep dive into the science and realized what was happening. And so I was hopeless about that. Now I'm feeling a little less hopeless. I'm sort of asking people to lean into amphibious housing and other things that we can do to sort of let the water in, because the water's going to come in anyway. So how are we going to accommodate that? How are we going to live with that? So instead of trying to stop the water from coming in, which has been our program for the past 100 years. Let's stop the water from coming in. Now we have to think about how can we let the water in, like really let it in, and that means, to me, amphibious housing. I think about climate change a lot, just because we are here on the front line of climate change. And as I mentioned before, we're the canary in the coal mine. And so what we're experiencing now, a lot of other coastal communities and further in will begin to experience, and that's going to drive worldwide migration. So migration is only going to become more of a thing, not less of a thing. No matter what we do about immigration, folks are going to migrate. Half of Southeast Louisiana is going to migrate. It's already started to happen with that community down in Plaquemines Parish that got moved. So they were the first American climate change refugees. And yeah, it's like trying to, how do we come to terms with the fact that we are going to be American climate change refugees? So anyway, I think we do have a huge connection with other people in the world because of that, because we're the canary in the coal mine.
Oh man, I always like the stories about the time my dad and his brother tried to paddle across the Mississippi River in an old wash tub or something, and it kind of sunk halfway through. And there's been a few, stories of failed attempts of crossing in less than ideal watercraft. But I enjoy kayaking. There's an island near where I live, the St. Maurice Towhead, but the Mississippi River is full of these little islands that you can camp on, and it's just, that's a lot of fun. I don't know.
You ever do overnights? Like paddling and stuff?
That's what we do. We paddle from my friend's property across the river to the towhead, and we camp overnight there, and then you paddle back. So, yeah, my friends live right there on, on the land side, and you just cross by kayak or skiff or whatever. So we usually have somebody on a skiff because we have a lot of gear that we have to bring out. But, some of us want to paddle and pack it light. The bird watching is amazing. Like the birds that you see flying through there, the pelicans, just everything, and eagles, osprey, the nature that you can see, it's amazing.
The river was not symbolic of any of taking you anywhere. You know what I mean?
No,
for guys, it's more transportation.
Transportation, yeah. Well, for me, we were very poor, and you would see the boats go by, and I used to wonder where they were going and what it was like to ride in a river boat, but it was always a mystery, another mystery, and I really didn't understand how long the river was until I, started reading about it, and I said, my goodness, this thing goes on forever. And so that part amazed me, but as far as me exploring that distance, I wouldn't mind taking that journey, just the river journey where you go and follow the river, and I think they offer tours like that where you just follow the river and explore, just looking at the different areas. I took one trip on a river boat where we just was in New Orleans, where you see the sugarcane factory and all that stuff. That was interesting. But it was more, it was geared more towards people, not the river, because you had music on board, and stuff like that.
Well, it just shows you that New Orleans was this really important economic center, and that with the ships coming in and out, the port was big, and the wharves, like I said, covered every square inch of land up and down the banks. Not like New York, where they had perpendicular docks. This was lengthwise. But my family always acted like it was the river that made New Orleans rich. And in those times, before the Depression, it was really a boom town. I tell you that as a child, I heard Old Man River, a song that most people know about. Paul Robeson, we had the '78 record, and I was quite small when I first heard it, but I was very, very impressed with this song, and my parents actually let me put the record on and play it whenever I wanted to, which was a lot. And that was when I was very small. In the 5th grade, John Churchill Chase came to my 5th grade class, and he handed out these books these cartoon books he made of Louisiana Purchase history. And in there is a cartoon of Old Man River. And Old Man River has a long beard, and he's got all these tributaries, and he's really, when I saw in the 5th grade, when I opened the book, and I said, there's Old Man River. There he is. Somehow, to me, he existed, or he represented like how hard the people have to work all along the Mississippi, whether they're on the ships or farmers along the Mississippi, and their plight. And the longer I listened to his singing and his record, the more and more impressed I am with with the spirit he deals with the problems of all these people who are involved along the Mississippi, who just keeps rolling along. I was very impressed with that song, and I still am. And the more I find out about Paul Robeson and his fame and his troubles, you know, to be recognized for what he is, the more I respect the song, too. So there's a song. If I can go a little further, then when I was about 10 years old, we used to go and play on the levee, and I was in Girl Scouts, and we'd sing, and we sang this song, "Hey, hey, Uncle Dud, it's a treat to beat your feet on the Mississippi mud." And I had no idea, no clue where it came from. Little did I know Bing Crosby was singing that on the radio. And later, but before that, Kid Ory, Paul Whiteman were playing this song, "Hey, hey, Uncle Dud." Ray Charles did it. The Muppets did it. This is much later. Now, it's one of those songs that has that feeling of the minstrel show, which people now are, you don't want to go there. You know, they don't want to talk about it, but I think we need to talk about it. That maybe the song has racial aspersions, and you don't want to do that. But nevertheless, it didn't mean that to us. It meant to us we were going to go and play in the mud on the Mississippi River, which has lots of mud. You know, lots of mud in their life. Anyway, this...
The mud flats by the Bachelor.
Yes. And this musical history of the river kind of goes on with Jimmy Rogers, who was a brakeman on the train, came to New Orleans, and his wonderful line of his song, "Miss the Mississippi and You." And it's, "I'm growing tired of the big city lights." What a wonderful line to start, you know? And then you can go to John Hartford, and John Hartford is a fiddle player, and all he wanted to be was a pilot on the Mississippi, and that's what he was. And he would fiddle and sing his way up and down the river, and he was one of those fiddle players who could play the fiddle and dance and sing all at the same time. It's, you know, so I just like this feeling. Now, I've done radio shows with 30, 40, 60 songs about the Mississippi River. There's many, many more, because I think it's just, it has, I don't know, I can look out there and just say it has this strength or something, even at low water, but even like now. And maybe we are pulling some strength from the Mississippi River. And maybe that's got important influence. And it also tells us that we're not as smart and big as we think we are sometimes, you know, when it has its own way.
So my great-great-grandfather wanted to have a farm in western Indiana near Terre Haute on the Wabash, near the Wabash River. And in order to facilitate and have the funds to get the farm, each year he would walk from the farm in western Indiana to Louisville, Kentucky, get on log rafts that went from down the Ohio River to the Mississippi. And if he was lucky, the rafts he was with would go all the way to New Orleans. Sometimes they stopped in Memphis. He would get paid $5 a day, and then he would take that money and walk up the Natchez Trace all the way to the land office in Jeffersonville, Indiana, in southern Indiana, and then back to the farm. And each time he did that, he would buy a few more acres, and he did that for several years until he had an 800-acre farm.
Mm-hmm. And does the family still have the farm?
We do. We still have the farm. We have a 92-year-old cousin living on the farm. She's the last one, so we'll see how long we keep it. But we do. We've had the farm well over 100 years.
That's wonderful.
I had the opportunity, it was, I would say, August of 2020, to sort of take a trip up to Minnesota, to Lake Itasca, to the watershed. And the goal was to drive up one side of the Mississippi and down the other. And this was, I mean, for me, it was the benefit of this project of the artist Ana Hernandez, who work really centers on aspects of the river and different things of that nature. And so there's this relationship to the Mississippi, the river, the iconic shape of the bend. You see it and you think, you know, New Orleans, you know. But to be in other cities and sort of see their relationship to the river was interesting. I mean, for some it was another river, another body of water passing through it, you know. And then there was others that, well, it was just as celebrated as it is here, you know. But just even moving through, I mean, the plan was to drive up River Road, and so just driving up River Road and seeing sort of the different aspects, sort of thinking of what's happening along the Mississippi. So there was a lot of, like, you know, industry that was happening, you know, in the lower regions of the Mississippi. And then as you got further up, and the quality, I feel like quality of the water was better. You started to see sort of, you know, who was living on the Mississippi, you know, who was allowed to live there and who wasn't. And so that was sort of an interesting kind of look at sort of how people are existing with the Mississippi, I mean, in other states, other cities. But then just too, the contrast from like the west of the Mississippi versus the east of the Mississippi was interesting, considering it seems like there was more highways, more industry on the east side of the Mississippi. And so for that, I found there was more, I don't know, just, it seemed more like cities there, where there's like small towns and rural areas on the west side. But overall, yeah, it was an interesting journey. It was, I mean, it was a task. It was a feat to drive it, but I definitely appreciated Ana sort of inviting me along to sort of take that trip with her as she did her research and for her projects. But yeah, it was, and also too, just thinking of the different, I mean, one thing that stood out to me about one of the things that she was doing in her project was that looking at the different sounds that it made at different key points, you know, and how those currents had different sounds and they moved and they vibrated at different sort of frequencies. So that was a curious. I think one of the benefits of working and living with an artist who is heavily research-based is that you sort of get the privilege of like unsolicited knowledge, you know? And so yeah, I think that it was just eye-opening. It's like it was never something I would have thought to do or cared to do. And so because of her practice, I think I benefited from having that experience, you know? And it was great to have, to see. And to put the city in context with other cities and this river in context with other segments of it, you know? Because a lot of, I think I kind of functioned like most people in New Orleans, like keyed in on this section of the river, you know, and just identified with that bend and didn't think much else of where, you know, where the rest of it came from and what life was like in those regions, you know, so.
Or even what it does for people.
Yeah, I mean, the industry coming up and down it, you know. But also too, thinking like, yeah, how much the river has sort of worked to sort of spread the population of people kind of coming to the U.S. and sort of thinking about all those migration stories. And there's like so many people in far-reaching parts of the U.S. that, you know, managed to get there because of this, you know, this river. And so that, I think, when I did see diversity, I think that was probably a factor of this, you know, river, sort of giving people somewhere to land. I mean, growing up with the river here in New Orleans, I feel like the thing that stood out to most was sort of this like impending sort of doom of living in the city that's below sea level and the river rising and flooding us out, you know? So it's like, what does that mean? When is that gonna happen? So whenever we get hard rains or there is like talks of river rising, you know, that alarm would go off like, oh, you know, we're in this city below sea level, you know? But then also too, being someone who like really never learned to swim, I mean, swimming to safety didn't seem like an option for me either, you know, so, but, I mean, I'm still here, the river's still here, so who knows, you know?